Around the Christmas season, I have friends, well, Facebook friends, so kind of acquaintance friends. Some of them are agnostic, and they start asking me questions about the narrative around Christmas. They'll pose it in the form of questions, which they sometimes pose in not always a particularly friendly way of, you do realize that the Christmas story is only in 2 of the 4 Gospels. And I'm like, yeah, I did go to seminary, I get that. And that those 2 don't always agree. Yeah, I also know that. And that some of the stuff that we have in the Nativity is just simply pious legend. And I'll say, yeah, I get that too. And then the question becomes, well then, why do you believe in it? It's not factually true. It's not a historical account in the modern sense. It doesn't hold up to the idea of the 5 senses and modern history and all of that kind of thing. So why does it have value at all? I mean, it's just a story. When it comes down to it, it really is just a lie. And that's not as important as the things that we can experience with our senses, with the things that our rationality teaches us. Those things just don't have real value. And I'd say, well, I just have to disagree with that.
There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it. The dark side. The Jedi. They're real.
The Force. It's calling to you. Just let it in.
Do you see what's being done there in that trailer? That it's all true, it all happened? And the response that people of my generation have to that, because we've grown up with this Star Wars myth. The Star Wars myth is very, very powerful, despite the fact that, you can tell from the first 3 movies that George Lucas couldn't write a romantic scene if his very life depended on it. Nevertheless, the mythological depth of the Star Wars saga is such that it is known all over the world. It's almost universal. I heard one of the actresses who's from a country in Africa talking about growing up, and in her country they played Star Wars on one day every year, and everybody knew that's what you did on that day was watch Star Wars. It's not just an American narrative. This is important stuff. It makes a big difference in our culture. You now have people who are training in Jedi academies in major large cities. In England in 2011, 176,000 people identified themselves as Jedi under their religious affiliation. Now, a lot of that is people just saying, you don't really have any business knowing what my religion is, so I'm putting down Jedi. But the fact that it can be thought of as a religious affiliation means that it has depth and that it has meaning to people. Just because something's a story doesn't mean that it's not true. As the author Dermot McCullough says in his book, Christianity, is Shakespeare's Hamlet true? It never happened, but it seems to be much more true, full of meaning and significance for human beings, than the reality of the breakfast I ate this morning, which was certainly true in a banal sense. When I try to talk to people about this idea of myth, and we've lost this idea of myth and how important it is to us in the Enlightenment to some degree, I often go back to the authors C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien from the 20th century, the author of Narnia and The Lord of the Rings. And they were friends in Oxford after World War I. And Lewis was struggling. He was an agnostic who felt himself drawn to religion, but couldn't quite figure it out. And he spent a lot of time talking to J.R.R. Tolkien, who was a devout Christian his entire life. And this clip I'm going to show you never actually happened. It's a constructed dialogue that's taken from their reminiscences and from their writings. So all of it is their stuff. It's just never happened all in this one context.
But myths are fiction. The stories they tell aren't true. They're lies and therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver. They're just beautiful lies. You can't seriously believe in fairy tales.
Why not? I can, in fact, I do.
But this is preposterous. How can you seriously believe a lie?
Oh, Jack, myths are not lies. In fact, they're the very opposite of a lie. Myths convey the essential truth, the primal reality of life itself.
Go on.
Well, you see, we had been duped into using the word myth as being synonymous with a lie. Myths show us a fleeting glimpse of truth itself.
Truth. Truth. What on earth is this truth that you're talking about?
Quid est veritas? What is truth? I'm glad to see that you've entered into the spirit of the myth, Jack. You've just cast yourself into the role of pilot. You're acting as if myths are mere arbitrary inventions of fiction, as if we pull them out of thin air. But what you don't understand is that we make things by the law in which we are made. We create because we are created. Creativity, imagination, is God's imageness in us. We tell stories because God is a storyteller. In fact, He is the storyteller. We tell our stories with words. He tells His story with history. The facts of history are His words, and providence is His storyline.
Are you suggesting that all of history, that everything around us is all part of some divine myth?
We are all part of His story. This very conversation is part of His story.
But perhaps it isn't His story, perhaps it's only your story. How can you know that your story, the story that you believe, the Christian story, is any more real than the other stories?
But don't you see, it isn't my story, it's His story. You're acting as if Christianity is one myth among many. It's not, it's the true myth. Christianity really happened. Jesus really existed, so did Pilate, and yet it is this true story that makes sense of all the other stories. It is the archetype. It is the story in which all the other stories have their source, and the story to which all the other stories point. It has everything. It has catastrophe and its opposite, what we might call eucatastrophe. It has the joy of the happy ending, the sudden joyous turn in the story that is essential to all myths. It has to a sublime degree this joy of deliverance, this evangelium, this fleeting glimpse of the real joy, to which all other joys are but a distant echo.
Tell what did you mean by catastrophe and eucatastrophe?
Well, for example, it has the catastrophe of the fall and the eucatastrophe of the redemption. It has the catastrophe of the crucifixion and the eucatastrophe of the resurrection. It has everything man's heart desires, because it is being told by the one who is the fulfillment of desire itself. It is a story that begins and ends in joy.
But just because a story brings joy, it doesn't necessarily follow that it's true. There are many joyful myths. They all seem rather flimsy to me and ring rather false.
And yet this story has the inner consistency of reality. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits.
Perhaps it's just a very well-written artifice.
This story has the supremely convincing tone of primary art, not fiction, but of creation. And to reject this leads either to darkness or to wrath. And in my own life, it has led me from darkness to light.
Of course, C.S. Lewis goes on to be one of the most important Christian authors of the 20th century. Myths are not lies, because they convey the deepest truths of who we are as human beings. Our stories define who we are, for better or for worse. But in the very best stories, we always see the same face. Our human creations come and go, but the story of Jesus is the story behind all of these others. This Christmas, suspend your disbelief. Go see Star Wars. Rewatch The Lord of the Rings. Indulge yourself in some really bad Rankin-Bass mythology around Santa Claus. But take some time to reflect on Jesus, the myth-made man who stands behind all our stories. Amen.